It was supposed to be a routine haul through the rural backroads of Nebraska. Jack, a seasoned long-haul trucker, was no stranger to desolate highways or eerie, empty landscapes. He'd seen it all, or so he thought. The dispatcher called him in at dusk, giving him a short-notice job for a client who needed a delivery up north by morning. Jack shrugged it off. The job was simple. The pay, fair enough. But there was something strange in the air that night. A thick, oppressive silence that filled the early hours of the drive. He chalked it up to fatigue and pressed on, headlights cutting through the surrounding dark. Around midnight, he noticed the road getting rougher, almost as if it hadn't been maintained for years. The trees loomed closer to the highway's edge, their branches stretched out like skeletal arms. Jack felt uneasy, but pushed the feeling down. It was then that he saw the first sign, a rusted metal sheet nailed to an old oak tree, with the words "Road Closed" scrawled across it in what looked like faded red paint. His GPS told him to keep going straight, and ignoring his gut, he rolled forward, past the sign and deeper into the darkness. The further he went, the more surreal everything became. His headlights revealed abandoned vehicles here and there, some half sunken in mud, others looking as though they'd been abandoned in a hurry. He thought about stopping, but the urgency to get the job done kept him moving. After what felt like an hour, he began seeing other signs, each one bearing stranger messages. "Turn back now," "Dead end," and "You'll never leave." He laughed nervously, telling himself it was some prank, maybe teenagers looking to scare travelers. But an instinct gnawed at him, telling him to turn around. Yet something deeper, almost like a compulsion, kept his foot on the gas pedal. Then, a figure appeared on the side of the road. She was drenched in moonlight, a woman dressed in a tattered, mud-streaked gown, her hair hanging in messy waves over her face. She stood motionless, head slightly tilted, staring at his truck as he slowed down. Jack's grip tightened on the steering wheel. He couldn't just leave her there, could he? But as he reached the side of the road, he felt an overwhelming dread. Against his better judgment, he stopped and rolled down the window. "Ma'am, are you okay?" he called out, his voice steady but tense. She didn't answer. Instead, her head slowly lifted, and through the tangled mess of her hair, he could see her eyes. They were black voids, bottomless pits that seemed to draw in the light. Jack's blood turned cold as she took a step toward him. Her mouth opened, and a chilling guttural sound filled the night air, something between a laugh and a scream. Without thinking, he slammed his foot on the gas and took off, his truck barreling down the road as he fought the urge to look back. He felt her presence behind him, a heavy, looming weight that seemed to cling to his trailer, dragging him down, slowing him. The truck's engine roared louder, struggling, like it was fighting against something invisible. His hands were shaking, and his breath came in short, shallow gasps. Then his CB radio crackled to life, filling the cab with static, before an eerie voice broke through, barely audible over the hiss. "Keep driving, Jack," the voice whispered, a cold rasp that sent shivers down his spine. His eyes darted to the radio. He hadn't used his real name on this route. No one should have known it. His mind raced, but he couldn't stop. He just had to get out. The radio went silent again, but the sense of being watched intensified, prickling the back of his neck. He drove for what felt like hours, though the clock on his dashboard didn't seem to move. Time felt stretched, twisted. When he looked down again, he realized he was almost out of fuel, and just as the panic set in, he spotted lights ahead, a diner. He didn't question it, only steered into the gravel lot, barely stopping before jumping out of the cab. The place was empty. Inside, a waitress with a blank, vacant stare looked up as he entered, her face pale and expressionless. "Are you lost?" she asked, her voice flat, almost mechanical. "Yes," he replied, trying to steady his breathing. "I just need fuel and directions back to the main highway." She didn't respond, only pointed to a booth in the corner. On the table was a faded map, one with lines and routes that didn't match any he'd seen before. He picked it up, feeling the waitress's hollow gaze on him the entire time. The map seemed ancient, and on it was a marked path leading away from his current location, a winding road that snaked through dense forests and crossed several bridges, each marked with an X. "Follow the map," the waitress said, her eyes never blinking. "It's the only way out." Jack grabbed it, hurrying back to his truck. When he glanced back, the diner lights flickered, and the waitress was gone. The place was empty, as if it hadn't been occupied in years. He climbed into his cab, heart pounding, and started the engine. He didn't know what else to do but follow the map. Hours passed as he drove, the forest around him growing thicker, more oppressive. Shadows danced on the road, shapes that seemed to shift and crawl. His headlights barely pierced the darkness, and the road twisted and turned in impossible ways. Just as dawn began to break, the road led him to a clearing. In the middle stood an ancient abandoned truck, its cab tilted and broken, covered in rust and vines. He stepped out, drawn to it, compelled to look inside. Through the cracked window, he saw the driver, or what was left of him, a skeletal figure slumped over the wheel, mouth frozen in a scream, hollow eyes staring out at nothing. Jack stumbled back, his mind reeling, and as he turned, he saw the woman from before, standing just a few feet away, her black eyes fixed on him. "Stay," she whispered, her voice echoing inside his head. Jack backed away, scrambling to his truck, not daring to look back as he gunned the engine and tore down the road. When he finally emerged onto a familiar highway, the morning sun blinding him, he felt a weight lift, the sense of dread dissipating. Shaking, he checked his watch. Somehow, the entire night had passed, and he was nearly out of time for his delivery. But when he looked at his surroundings, his truck, he realized something more disturbing. His cab was covered in scratches, handprints, and symbols he didn't recognize, all carved into the metal as if by something sharp. And on the seat beside him lay the faded map from the diner, the edges frayed, marked with dirt, and what looked suspiciously like dried blood. To this day, Jack never takes the back roads. Some nights, on long, empty stretches, he swears he can hear the radio crackle, a faint whisper telling him, "You'll be back." The night was thick with fog, a clinging, inky blackness that seemed to swallow the headlights of Rick's truck as he made his way along an isolated road in the Appalachian Mountains. Rick was a seasoned trucker, a lone wolf by nature, but even he was unnerved by the quiet that hung in the air. He had heard stories about these mountains, tales whispered around truck stop counters, but he'd always shrugged them off. It was just a road, he reminded himself, trying to ignore the feeling gnawing at his gut. The job was simple enough: drive overnight and deliver cargo by morning. He was hauling a shipment of machinery, nothing unusual. But as he climbed further into the mountains, the fog grew denser, and soon he could barely see the road ahead. He flipped on his high beams, but they did little to cut through the thick mist. It felt as if the darkness was alive, pressing in on him, suffocating. Then, suddenly, his radio crackled to life, a static hum that made him jump. He hadn't touched the CB all night, hadn't even checked if it was working. A garbled voice came through, whispering, "Turn back. Turn back." The hairs on his arms rose. Who could possibly be out here? He reached for the dial, trying to switch channels, but the voice persisted, growing louder, more insistent. Just as quickly as it had started, the voice stopped, leaving only dead silence. The fog seemed to grow thicker, and then, out of nowhere, he saw it. Something standing in the middle of the road. Rick's heart leaped as he slammed on the brakes, his tires screeching as the truck skidded to a halt. There, in the harsh glare of his headlights, stood a man. His clothes were tattered, his face pale and expressionless, but it was his eyes that made Rick's blood run cold. They were empty, devoid of any life or warmth, staring blankly at him, unblinking. Rick honked his horn, hoping the man would move, but he didn't so much as flinch. Slowly, the man raised his arm, pointing down a side road that veered off into the woods. Rick's instincts screamed at him to stay on the main road, to ignore whatever this strange man was trying to indicate. But something in the man's hollow stare seemed to pull him in, drawing him to that dark, narrow road. He tried to shake it off, to pull away, but his hands were moving on their own. He was turning the wheel, easing the truck down the side road, despite every part of him that wanted to resist. The fog seemed to thicken even more, curling around the truck like a living thing. The further he drove, the more the road narrowed, and soon tree branches were scraping against his windows, like fingers clawing at the glass. The GPS went haywire, the screen flickering before shutting off completely. The radio crackled again, but this time there was no voice, only a faint, rhythmic thumping, like footsteps pacing in the back of his trailer. A chill ran down Rick's spine. He'd locked up the cargo tight. There was no way anyone could be back there. but the thumping grew louder, as if something or someone was moving around in his trailer. Desperate to know what was going on, he pulled the truck to a stop. He grabbed a flashlight from his glove compartment and stepped out into the suffocating fog, his breath visible in the frigid air. He walked to the back of the trailer, the flashlight beam barely cutting through the darkness. His heart pounded as he unlocked the latch and swung open the heavy door. The beam of his flashlight revealed only rows of crates, nothing out of the ordinary. He let out a shaky breath, feeling a mix of relief and lingering unease. But just as he turned to close the door, he heard it. Scratching. It was coming from one of the crates, faint but unmistakable. He froze, holding his breath, listening. The scratching grew louder, more frantic, like claws scraping against metal. He wanted to slam the doors shut to get back in his cab and get the hell out of there, but his curiosity got the best of him. He took a step closer, flashlight trembling in his hand as he leaned toward the crate. Suddenly, the scratching stopped and a deathly silence filled the trailer. Rick's stomach twisted as he stared at the crate, waiting, unsure if he dared open it. But before he could make up his mind, the lid of the crate exploded open, and a hand, pale, clawed, and impossibly long, shot out, grasping at the edge of the crate. Rick stumbled back, dropping the flashlight as something began to crawl out. The creature was twisted, malformed, something that had once been human but was now hideously wrong. Its skin was stretched tight over sharp, bony limbs, its mouth a wide, gaping maw filled with jagged teeth. It looked at him with those same empty eyes he'd seen on the man in the road, eyes that held no soul, no mercy. Rick turned and bolted, slamming the trailer doors shut behind him as he sprinted back to the cab. He could hear the creature pounding against the doors, the sound echoing in the night as he climbed into his truck, his hands shaking as he fumbled to start the engine. The pounding grew louder, more frenzied, as he threw the truck into gear and took off down the road. As he drove, he could hear the thing in his trailer, scratching and clawing, trying to break free. The fog began to lift slightly, but he didn't feel any relief. He felt something much worse, a growing, gnawing dread that whatever was in his trailer wasn't alone. Then, in the rearview mirror, he saw it. Figures, dozens of them, standing in the road behind him, their pale faces and empty eyes staring after him. They watched him, unmoving as he sped down the road, but he knew they weren't gone. They were waiting, watching. The thumping and scratching continued as he drove, relentless, as if the creature in his trailer was trying to claw its way into the cab, and the radio crackled to life once more, the same voice, hollow and empty, whispering, "You can't escape, Rick. You'll join us. Soon." For hours he drove, gripping the wheel until his knuckles turned white, his eyes wide and filled with terror. The radio never stopped, and neither did the scratching. When dawn finally broke, he found himself back on the main road, the fog lifting as the first rays of sunlight pierced through the trees. But the relief was short-lived. He glanced in the mirror, and there it was, his trailer, battered and clawed, covered in deep, jagged scratches. The doors were bent, nearly torn off their hinges, and faintly he could still hear the scratching, as if whatever was inside was waiting, biding its time. He drove into town, abandoning the truck at the first stop he found. He didn't wait for a tow or even call his dispatcher. He just left it, leaving the keys in the ignition, walking away without looking back. He never set foot in a truck again. But every now and then he swore he could still hear it. The scratching, faint but unmistakable, echoing in his mind like a nightmare that refused to fade. The road stretched out endlessly, winding through a desolate stretch of West Texas. Martin was pushing his rig through the quiet, barren plains under a nearly moonless sky. He'd been driving cross-country for years, but he always avoided this route. There was a reason truckers called it the dead road, though nobody could really say why. The dispatcher had promised Martin extra cash if he made the run tonight, so he'd taken it. But as he neared a part of the highway where the air seemed almost thicker, he felt a pang of regret. The clock on his dashboard ticked to midnight, and the radio signal began to wane. Static buzzed through his speakers, crackling and hissing. He adjusted the dial, trying to find a station, when a voice broke through, faint but clear. "Help. Me. Please." The voice was shaky, desperate, barely more than a whisper. Martin thought it might be a trucker on a nearby channel, but when he looked at his CB, it was dead. No lights, no power, just a blank screen. His heart pounded, but he ignored it and kept driving, determined to finish the haul. As he pushed on, the temperature began to drop unnaturally fast. His windows started fogging up, something he hadn't seen happen in years of driving through Texas. He rubbed at the windshield, but it was no use. The glass was ice cold to the touch. Out of the mist on the road, he saw a sign, a rusty, bullet-riddled relic with faded letters reading Hollow Bend, 5 miles. He didn't remember seeing Hollow Bend. He didn't remember Bend on any map, but as his truck rumbled closer, a figure appeared in the headlights, right at the road's edge. Martin slammed on the brakes, his heart thumping in his chest as he pulled the rig to a stop. Through the fog, he saw a woman standing by the side of the road. She wore a tattered white dress that looked as if it had been soaked in something dark and rusty. Her head bowed, her long black hair hiding her face. He rolled down the window, leaning out just slightly. "Miss, are you all right?" he called, his voice shaky. Slowly, she lifted her head, and when her eyes met his, he felt an icy chill sink into his bones. Her eyes were wide, hollow, and empty, almost as if she were staring right through him. But her lips moved, whispering in a voice as faint as wind. "Don't leave me." He wanted to drive away, wanted to tear down the road and forget he ever saw her. But his body seemed frozen, his hand gripping the wheel as she took a slow step closer. Her face was now illuminated by his headlights, and he could see that her skin was pallid, her cheeks gaunt. She looked like she hadn't eaten in years, her arms thin, her fingers reaching out toward his truck. Without thinking, he unlocked the door. As he did, her face twisted into a smile that was all wrong, stretching wider and wider until it looked like her mouth would split. Martin's blood ran cold as he tried to close the door, but it was too late. She stepped forward, her long fingers curling over the edge of the door. "Take me with you," she whispered, her voice echoing unnaturally. Martin yanked the door shut and threw the truck into gear, pressing down hard on the gas pedal. The truck lurched forward, and he felt a terrible wrench as if he'd hit something, but he didn't dare look back. He drove hard, the road blurring as he sped into the darkness, his hands white-knuckled on the wheel. Minutes passed, maybe hours, he couldn't tell. But as he began to calm, he heard it, the slow creak of metal coming from behind him in the cab. He dared a glance in the rearview mirror, and his heart sank. In the back, he saw her reflection, curled up in the passenger seat, her dark hair hiding her face. He slammed on the brakes, skidding to a stop on the deserted road. He whipped around, and she was gone. But as he sat there, breathing hard, he heard her whisper in his ear, "Don't leave me." He shuddered, pressing down on the gas again, desperate to get away. But the voice followed him, echoing in his mind, growing louder and more insistent with every mile. He switched on the radio, trying to drown it out, but her voice came through the speakers, filling the cab with her pleas. "Don't leave me, Martin." How did she know his name? He frantically pressed buttons, but every station was the same. Her whisper, pleading, begging him to stay with her. Desperate, he reached for his phone to call his dispatcher, but the battery was dead, drained to zero. Just as he tried to calm himself, he felt a tap on his shoulder. He didn't want to look, but couldn't resist. There she was, in the corner of his eye, close enough that he could feel her cold breath on his neck. "Why did you leave me, Martin?" With a scream, he swerved the truck, trying to shake her off, but he felt her icy fingers grip his arm. The truck veered off the road, crashing into the embankment. When he came to, his face bloodied, he was lying on the cold asphalt, the shattered remains of his truck strewn around him. But she was gone. The paramedics arrived and loaded him onto a stretcher, trying to reassure him, but he couldn't stop shaking. As they closed the ambulance doors, he saw her again, standing by the wreckage, watching him. Her lips moved, her mouth forming words he couldn't hear, but he knew what she was saying. "I'll see you soon, Martin." He spent weeks in the hospital, haunted by her empty eyes every time he closed his own. When he was finally discharged, he swore he'd never drive that road again. But sometimes, on quiet nights, when he's home alone, he still hears her voice, faint, whispering through the walls. "Don't leave me!" And somewhere out there, on that dark, desolate stretch of road, a pale figure in a tattered white dress waits for the next trucker who won't be able to resist her pull, hoping maybe this time he won't leave her behind. The night was unnaturally dark as Sam drove his truck through the winding roads of northern Wyoming. There was no moon to light the way, and the only sounds were the the low hum of the engine, and the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. Sam had been hauling cargo for over a decade, but he'd never seen a road quite like this one. His dispatcher had put him on a new route, one that cut straight through the Beartooth Mountains. He'd been warned to avoid it if possible, but the promise of extra pay was too tempting to pass up. As he drove further into the night, though, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The trees on either side of the road were thick and twisted, their branches stretching out like skeletal hands as if reaching for his truck. The air felt heavy, oppressive, and every so often he thought he saw movement in the shadows beyond his headlights. He tried to shrug it off as his mind playing tricks, I don't lose VGAF, but a chill crept down his spine. To distract himself, he flipped on the radio, but all he got was static. Annoyed, he switched it off and focused on the road. Then, out of nowhere, he saw it. A figure standing in the middle of the road, just on the edge of his high beams. Sam's heart jumped, and he hit the brakes, skidding to a stop just a few feet away. He could barely make out the details, a tall figure draped in what looked like tattered clothes, head tilted down so he couldn't see the face. For a long moment, the figure didn't move, and neither did Sam. Then, slowly, it lifted its head, and Sam caught a glimpse of empty, dark eyes staring straight at him. Before he could react, the figure took a step toward him, and a bone-chilling smile spread across its face. Without thinking, Sam threw the truck into reverse, tires screeching as he backed up, trying to put as much distance between himself and the thing as possible. But as he watched through the windshield, he saw the figure turn and start walking toward him, moving at an unnaturally fast pace. The headlights barely kept up, and as he watched, it began to run, its limbs jerking and twisting with each step, like it wasn't fully in control of its own body. Sam's hands were shaking as he threw the truck back into drive and stomped on the gas, speeding down the road, hoping to lose whatever it was. He risked a glance in the rearview mirror and saw that the figure was gone, swallowed by the darkness. He let out a shaky breath, gripping the wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. But just as he started to calm down, he heard it, a faint scraping noise coming from the back of his truck. He told himself it was nothing, just some cargo shifting, but the noise grew louder, more insistent, a steady scraping sound like nails running across metal. He glanced at the rearview mirror again, half expecting to see that figure, but the road behind him was empty. The scraping turned into pounding, rhythmic thumps that rattled the entire truck. Sam's heart pounded as he looked back at the trailer, his mind racing. There was no way anyone or anything could have gotten in there. He'd checked it himself before he left. Desperate, he pulled over to the side of the road, leaving the engine running as he grabbed a flashlight from the glove compartment. He stepped out into the cold night air, the silence pressing in around him as he made his way to the back of the truck. His hands were trembling as he unlocked the door and yanked it open, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. At first, he saw nothing but the neatly stacked boxes of cargo, and he let out a sigh of relief. But just as he started to close the door, his light caught something, a shape, huddled in the corner of the trailer, partially hidden behind a crate. His blood ran cold as he realized it was the figure he'd seen on the road, crouched in the darkness, its empty eyes staring straight at him. He stumbled back, dropping the flashlight as the figure rose slowly, unfolding its limbs like it was piecing itself back together. It took a step toward him, and he could see its face clearly now, pale and gaunt, with a twisted grin that stretched far too wide. Sam's mind screamed at him to run, but his body was frozen, rooted to the spot. "Why did you stop, Sam?" The figure whispered, its voice a low, mocking hiss that seemed to echo inside his head. He turned and bolted back to the cab, slamming the door shut and locking it, his heart racing as he scrambled to put the truck in gear. But before he could drive away, he heard a tap on the window beside him. Slowly, he turned, and there it was, the figure, its face pressed against the glass, smiling that awful too-wide grin. Its empty eyes met his, and he could feel a terrible weight settle over him, like it was staring right into his soul. With a scream, he floored the gas, the truck lurching forward as he sped down the road, the figure disappearing from the window. He didn't dare look back, didn't even slow down until he was miles away, his heart pounding in his chest. He drove until he reached the next town, pulling into a brightly lit gas station, desperate for some sense of safety. As he sat there, catching his breath, he realized the radio was still on, the static now replaced by a soft, faint voice. It was whispering his name, over and over, a cold, mocking sound that sent shivers down his spine. Sam, Sam, you can't leave me behind. He ripped the radio out of the dash, tossing it onto the passenger seat, but the voice continued, growing louder and more insistent. In a panic, he jumped out of the truck, slamming the door behind him. But as he turned to walk away, he saw it. A single handprint on the outside of his driver's side window, smeared in what looked like dark, dried blood. He never got back in that truck. He quit the job the next morning, leaving without ever looking back. But every night since, he still hears it, the faint, mocking whisper echoing through the silence of his empty house. Sam, you can't leave me behind. And he knows, deep down, that it's only a matter of time before it finds him again.